Picture this, a peaceful autumn day in rural Pakistan, the kind where the air is crisp and the fields stretch out like a faded painting of my childhood. I decided to revisit my family's long-neglected farm, a sprawling property that'd been in our blood for generations, a quiet refuge from the chaos of life. It had been years since I'd walked those serene acres, but as I approached, nostalgia hit me hard. Memories of simpler times, or at least the way a kid sees them, flooded back. The farmhouse stood weathered but proud, the fields barren yet familiar. I was lost in those thoughts, tracing the outlines of my past when my tranquility shattered. There, on the edge of my land, near my neighbor Ahmed's property, I stumbled across a nightmare. Piles of trash and hazardous waste strewn across what was once pristine soil. Plastic bags flapped in the wind like grotesque flags. A rancid stench assaulted my nose, and then I saw it. Radioactive medical waste, glowing faintly among the debris carelessly dumped across a good chunk of my property. My stomach churned, my blood turned to ice. Fury surged through me as I traced the mess back to its source, Ahmed's land. This wasn't a one-time lapse. He'd turned my farm into his personal dumping ground, likely for years, taking advantage of my absence. I stormed over to confront him, finding him working his fields near the boundary line, his arrogance practically radiating off him. "Ahmed, what have you done?" I demanded, my voice sharp with anger. He looked up, smirking, the audacity dripping from his eyes. "Why do you care? This land was just sitting here abandoned. I figured I could put it to good use, better than you and your family ever did." His words lit a fire in me. I insisted he clean it up immediately, but he brushed me off, dismissing me as some absentee whiner. Our argument escalated, words flying like bullets, but he stood firm, unrepentant, that smug grin plastered on his face. It was infuriating. His entitlement had grown unchecked, fueled by years of bulldozing through life without consequence. Faced with his stubbornness, I knew arguing was pointless. This wasn't just about trash. It was about respect, boundaries, and the land my family had poured their lives into. I turned to the legal route, reporting the illegal dumping to Pakistan's Environmental Protection Agency. Investigators arrived fast, taking samples, confirming the mess wasn't just garbage. It was a toxic wasteland, courtesy of Ahmed's prolonged negligence. The evidence was damning, but he didn't flinch, even doubling down with threats when I wouldn't back off. Fear flickered in his eyes for a moment, replaced quickly by a menacing glare, but I wasn't deterred. I filed a lawsuit, trespassing, illegal dumping, criminal threats, seeking damages, cleanup costs, and charges. The courtroom became a battleground, a slow grind of patience and persistence. Ahmed's aggression only grew as the case built against him, his influence and bravado shielding him, or so he thought. He blamed me, claimed my absence caused the land's natural deterioration, a laughable lie given the radioactive sludge seeping across my fields. Then came the twist. Tests traced the waste to a stolen hospital shipment, exposing Ahmed's ties to a criminal network dealing in radioactive materials. His mask slipped, revealing not just an entitled neighbor, but a crook. The court convicted him, 10 years in prison, a fitting end to his reign of arrogance. Justice won, but the scarred land lingered, a bitter reminder, though the settlement promised restoration, and I was determined to see it through. The courtroom victory over Ahmed felt like a weight lifting, but it was only the beginning of a much larger unraveling, one that stretched beyond my farm and into the dark corners of my hometown's past. While Ahmed's sentencing was a personal triumph, it stirred memories of another story, one I'd stumbled across on Reddit's r/AskReddit. Revenge of the Outcast, a town reckoning. It wasn't set in Pakistan, but in a small, conservative town steeped in religion where I'd grown up as the trench coat kid, or the local equivalent. Born out of wedlock to a mother shunned for surviving a horrific crime, I was branded a sinful outcast from day one. My mother had been assaulted by her uncle, a big shot in the town's religious hierarchy, and his cronies. When she got pregnant with me, they painted her as the villain, a temptress who'd seduced married men, and cast her out. She stayed anyway, raising me in that wretched place until alcoholism claimed her. My childhood was hell, bullied relentlessly, even by teachers who saw me as tainted. I leaned into the damaged label, crafting a hostile persona to keep everyone at bay. Despite it all, I graduated with decent grades, thanks to a distant aunt who got me into a city college. My mother's life insurance funded my escape, and in the city, I found therapy, healing, and a new life as an analytical consultant for an international firm. Years later, fate handed me a golden ticket. I was assigned to assess 3 factories for relocation, and one was in my hometown, a one-smokestack town where 60% of folks worked at the plant, the rest supporting it. Run by the same religious clique that had tormented me, it was a cesspool of mismanagement, promotions based on holiness, not skill. Returning was surreal. The chubby outcast was now a corporate suit, unrecognizable at first. I audited their processes, sifted through lies, and dropped hints until they realized who I was. They threw a party in my honor, old bullies reminiscing about fake good times, until I'd mentioned specific cruelties they'd inflicted, watching their smiles falter. I'd laugh it off, masking the hatred boiling inside, relishing their discomfort. These were the same people who'd made my life and my mother's a nightmare, and now I held their fate in my hands. Driving around town after, I saw how little had changed. The same stifling piety, the same small-minded lives. Power's allure hit me then, I could strip it all away. My report was a masterpiece of truth, no lies needed. I just polished every flaw until it gleamed. The factory shut down over 3 years and the town crumbled. No new businesses, just drugs, crime, and broken families. I'd stalked their misery on social media, feeling no remorse. Back to Ahmed, his conviction echoed that same reckoning. The radioactive waste wasn't just negligence, it tied him to a criminal network, a revelation that stunned the courtroom. He got 10 years, but even in defeat, he hurled threats my way, unrepentant to the end. The settlement for my land was a start, but restoration would take time and money. Still, I was set on it. Both stories converged in my mind. Ahmed's downfall and my town's collapse, 2 tales of justice born from years of entitlement and abuse. One was personal, the other a slow-burn revenge, but both left scars. My farm's toxic soil, my town's withered husk. Yet in both, I'd outlasted the bastards who thought they could walk over me, and that was a victory worth savoring. Ahmed's prison sentence was still fresh in my mind, the echo of his curses ringing as they dragged him away, when I found myself reflecting deeper on how this tied to my past. The farm wasn't just land, it was my family's legacy, a piece of me I'd neglected until his arrogance forced me back. That fight for justice mirrored my hometown reckoning in ways I couldn't ignore. Back in that suffocating town, shutting down the factory wasn't just about revenge. It was about stripping power from those who'd wielded it like a club against me and my mother. The religious elite, my uncle included, had run that plant into the ground, prioritizing piety over competence, and I'd handed them the bill. As the town withered, jobs gone, families fractured, I felt a cold satisfaction watching it unfold from afar. With Ahmed, it started simpler but grew just as personal. After the investigators confirmed the radioactive waste on my farm, I'd pushed forward with the lawsuit, fueled by rage and a need to reclaim what was mine. The legal battle was brutal, months of depositions, evidence piling up like the trash he'd dumped. Ahmed's defense was laughable. He claimed my absence invited his actions, that the land's deterioration was my fault. The judge didn't buy it, especially not with barrels of glowing medical waste leaking across my fields. Then came the bombshell, the waste linked to a stolen hospital shipment, implicating him in a criminal ring. His entitlement didn't just trash my property, it tied him to something far uglier. In court, he sat there, smug at first, blaming me for his mess, but as the evidence mounted, that mask cracked. The guilty verdict landed like a hammer, 10 years, plus fines he'd never pay. He spat threats as they hauled him off, but it was over. The settlement gave me funds to remediate the land, though the task loomed large. Back in my hometown, the factory's closure had a slower burn. I'd left after my report, but I kept tabs. Social media showed a town spiraling into despair, the same bullies now jobless, their sanctimonious leaders humbled. I dreamed of staying to watch their faces when the news hit, but work kept me away. Still, the outcome was the same. They paid for what they'd done to us. Ahmed's case wrapped faster, but the stakes felt just as high. Standing on my scarred farm after the verdict, I saw parallels. Both were battles against people who thought they could take what wasn't theirs and face no reckoning. My town's religious clique had abused their authority. Ahmed had abused my trust in land. In both, I'd turned their own arrogance against them. The town's economy tanked without that factory. No one stepped in to save it, and I didn't care. My farm, though, I'd save. The cleanup would be costly, but I'd hire experts, rip out the poison Ahmed left, and bring it back to life. It wasn't just about money. It was about honoring my family, something I'd forgotten in my years away. Both victories were bittersweet. The town's collapse left a hollowed-out shell, a ghost of the place that shaped me, good and bad. My farm's contamination was a wound I could heal, but it'd never erase the violation. Yet in both, I'd stood up, not just for myself, but for my mother, for the land, for what was right. Ahmed was behind bars, my uncle's legacy was dust, and I was still here unbroken. That's what mattered. With Ahmed locked away and the town's factory long shuttered, I stood at a crossroads. 2 chapters of retribution closed, but the aftermath lingered like a stubborn stain. The farm's cleanup loomed ahead, a tangible scar I could mend, while my hometown's ruin was a distant echo I'd set in motion years ago. Both were victories, sure, but they carried a weight I hadn't anticipated. After the trial, I walked my property again, the toxic mess still sprawled across the fields, a silent accusation of my years away. The settlement cash was a start, but experts warned it'd take months, maybe years, to purge the radioactive waste and restore the soil. I hired a team anyway, determined to see it through, not just for me, but for the generations who'd worked that land before Ahmed turned it into his dump. Back in my hometown, the fallout was less fixable. The factory's closure gutted the place. Unemployment spiked, businesses folded, and the once proud religious elite scrambled to save face. I'd check social media now and then, seeing old classmates post about overdoses or petty crimes, their smug lives unraveled. My uncle, the ringleader of my mother's torment, still clung to his crumbling influence, but the town's collapse chipped away at his throne. I'd only return when he died to spit on his grave. Until then, I let their misery fester. Ahmed's downfall played out faster but hit closer. In court, his arrogance had melted into desperation as the stolen waste tied him to a criminal network, way beyond what I'd expected. 10 years wasn't enough for the havoc he'd wreaked, but watching him unravel was a sight I'd never forget. He'd threatened me even as they cuffed him, his pride unbroken despite the evidence. Barrels of glowing sludge, traced to a hospital heist he'd profited from. The judge didn't flinch, guilty on all counts, restitution ordered, though he'd never pay it from a cell. My farm's restoration became my focus, a way to channel the anger from both fights. I'd been absent too long, letting Ahmed exploit that, just as I'd let my town fester in its hypocrisy until I could strike. Both were wake-up calls. Don't let what's yours slip away. Don't let bullies think they've won. The town's reckoning was colder, more calculated. I'd walked in as a ghost, audited their lies, and left them a report that burned their world down. With Ahmed, it was raw, confronting him face-to-face, watching his smirk fade as the law closed in. 2 different battles, same fire driving me. The farm cleanup started slow, hazmat suits, soil samples, endless paperwork. I'd visit, overseeing the progress, feeling the weight of my family's history in every shovelful of contaminated dirt. It wasn't cheap, but the settlement covered most, and I'd pour in whatever else it took. My hometown offered no such redemption. Its wounds were self-inflicted, widened by my pen. I didn't rebuild there, I let it rot, a monument to their sins. Ahmed's threats faded behind bars, my uncle's power faded with the town, and I stood stronger for it. The farm would heal, I'd make damn sure of it. The town wouldn't, and I was fine with that. Both taught me something. Justice isn't always clean, but it's yours to claim. I'd outlasted them all, Ahmed, the factory bosses, the pious hypocrites. And that was enough. For now, I'd focus on the land, turning poison back to promise, while the town stayed a memory I'd never mourn. The farm's cleanup kicked into gear, a slow grind of machinery and hazmat crews peeling back Ahmed's toxic legacy layer by layer. Each visit felt like a reckoning of my own. Years of absence had let this happen, and now I was clawing it back, one contaminated shovel at a time. The settlement money flowed into soil tests and bioremediation, but I'd sink my own cash in too. This wasn't just about fixing land. It was about fixing a piece of me I'd let drift. Meanwhile, my hometown's decay played out in grainy social media updates, a slow-motion train wreck I'd engineered. The factory's closure had left a void no one could fill, stores shuttered, kids turned to dope, and the old guard's sermons rang hollow without jobs to back their moralizing. My uncle's grip weakened, but he still breathed, so I stayed away, content to let the town choke on its own rot. Ahmed's fate was sealed tighter. 10 years in a Pakistani prison wasn't a slap on the wrist. His radioactive dumping and criminal ties earned him a cell where his threats couldn't reach me. I'd stood in that courtroom, watching his defiance crack as the gavel fell, a petty king dethroned. The stolen medical waste wasn't just negligence. It was a felony web he'd spun, thinking my empty fields were his free pass. The judge saw through his excuses. I saw justice, raw and real. Back at the farm, progress was tangible. Barrels hauled off, topsoil replaced, the stench fatting. Experts said full recovery could take years, but I'd be there for it, hands-on, honoring my family's sweat in that dirt. It wasn't cheap or quick, but it was mine to save. My town's ruin, though, was a different beast, distant, deliberate, and final. I'd walked in as a stranger, dissected their factory's failures, and walked out leaving a time bomb of a report. No one suspected the outcast kid had lit the fuse until it was too late. Their misery was their own doing, amplified by my hand, and I felt zero guilt watching it burn out. Ahmed's case had been personal, his smug face, his dismissive, "Why do you care?" igniting a fire I couldn't douse. I'd confronted him, boots on my own soil, and pushed until the law crushed him. The town was colder. I'd struck from afar, a ghost settling scores. Both were about taking back what was stolen. My land from Ahmed, my dignity from that pious cesspool. The farm's healing became my anchor. I'd check in weekly, watching green peek through where poison once ruled, a quiet victory over his entitlement. The town offered no such closure, just a graveyard of broken dreams I'd helped dig. My uncle's end would bring me back once to mark his grave with contempt, but until then I let them stew. Ahmed's threats echoed in memory, powerless now, while my farm grew stronger. Both fights taught me patience. Justice doesn't rush, but it lands hard when it does. I'd outlasted Ahmed's arrogance and the town's hypocrisy, turning their weapons against them. The farm would thrive again, I'd see to it, a living testament to resilience. The town wouldn't, a dead relic of their sins. Standing on my land, I felt the difference. One was redemption I could touch, the other retribution I could taste. Neither erased the past, but they proved I could rewrite the ending, and that was power enough. The farm's transformation was starting to take shape. Patches of clean soil spread like hope across the fields, the radioactive scars shrinking under the steady work of the cleanup crew. I'd roll up my sleeves some days, not just watching but digging in, feeling the dirt my ancestors had tilled. It was slow, expensive, and messy, but every inch reclaimed from Ahmed's mess felt like a middle finger to his entitlement. Back in my hometown, the collapse rolled on unchecked. No cleanup crew for that mess, just a town eating itself alive. Social media painted a grim picture: foreclosures, overdoses, the church's collection plates lighter every Sunday. My uncle's name still popped up, weaker now, a fading echo of the tyrant who'd ruined my mother. I'd go back when he croaked, but for now I let their self-made hell simmer. Ahmed's story had a tighter knot. Locked up for a decade, his empire of arrogance was reduced to a prison bunk, his threats bouncing off concrete walls. The courtroom scene replayed in my head, his smugness dissolving as the stolen waste tied him to a criminal syndicate, his 10-year sentence a brick wall he couldn't charm his way through. I'd stood there, staring him down, a quiet thrill in seeing him fall. He thought my absence gave him free rein. Instead, it gave me the leverage to bury him. The farm's revival was my focus now, practical, hands-on justice. I'd meet with the remediation team, poring over reports, watching the land breathe again. The settlement stretched far, but I'd cover the rest, driven by a need to honor what my family had built, something I'd lost sight of until Ahmed forced my hand. My town's ruin was less personal, more surgical. I'd cut its lifeline with a report, no confrontation needed. The factory's closure was a slow bleed, and I savored their panic from a distance, knowing the bullies who tormented me were now scrambling. Both were about reclaiming power, but the farm hit deeper. Ahmed's dumping was a direct violation. His smirk, his "why do you care?" still burned in my gut. I'd faced him, demanded answers, and when he doubled down, I'd turned to the law, watching it snap shut around him. The town was a ghost I'd haunted, slipping in, exposing their rot, and slipping out before they knew what hit them. The farm gave me something to build, the town something to bury. Progress on the land was steady, grass sprouting, the air cleaner, the past peeling away. I'd stand there, imagining crops again, a future where Ahmed's poison was just a bad memory. The town offered no such renewal, its carcass lay bare, a warning to hypocrites everywhere. My uncle's end would close that chapter, but until then I let it rot, a fitting tomb for their sins. Ahmed's defeat was final, bars held him, his threats empty. My victories weren't flawless, the farm's full recovery was years off, the town's fall left a hollow aftertaste, but they were mine. I'd turned Ahmed's arrogance into his cage, the town's piety into its noose. Standing on my land, I felt the difference. One was a fight I'd won up close, the other a war I'd won from afar. Both proved I could take back what was stolen, my heritage, my peace, and that was enough to keep me going, one reclaimed acre at a time. The farm was coming back to life, a slow resurrection I could see and touch, green shoots breaking through soil once choked with Ahmed's radioactive waste, the hum of cleanup crews a steady rhythm of progress. I'd walk the fields, dirt under my nails, feeling a connection I'd let slip away in my years abroad. It wasn't just about erasing his mess anymore. It was about proving something, to myself, to my family's ghosts, that this land wouldn't be defined by his arrogance. Meanwhile, my hometown's downfall played out like a grim rerun on social media. Empty storefronts, rusted factory gates, the pious elite clutching at straws. My uncle's name surfaced less, his influence a shadow of what it once was, and I waited for the day I'd hear he'd finally kicked it, my last trip back to seal that wound. Ahmed's fate was more immediate, more visceral. 10 years in a cell, his empire of entitlement crumbled, his threats reduced to noise in a prison yard. I'd replay that courtroom moment, his smug mask slipping as the judge listed his crimes: illegal dumping, trafficking stolen medical waste, a rap sheet that buried him. I'd faced him on my turf, demanded he answer for it, and when he sneered, I'd let the law do the rest. His fall was a fire I'd stoked up close. The town was a bomb I'd dropped from a distance. The farm's restoration was my lifeline now, tangible, urgent. I'd meet the crew weekly, tracking soil samples, watching the poison levels drop. The settlement stretched thin, but I'd fill the gaps, driven by a need to make this right, to turn neglect into purpose. My town's collapse was colder. I'd audited their factory, laid bare its rot, and left them to choke on the truth. No redemption there, just a reckoning they'd earned. Ahmed's violation had been personal. His "why do you care?" a taunt that lit my fuse. I'd confronted him, boots on my own ground, and pushed until he broke. The town was different, faceless, a machine I'd dismantled with paperwork, watching it seize up from afar. The farm gave me a fight to win daily, the town a victory to savor quietly. Progress on the land was real, crops weren't far off, the air no longer stung, Ahmed's shadow fatting. I'd stand there, picturing my grandfather's fields, knowing I'd get there, one clean acre at a time. The town offered no such hope, its bones picked clean by its own sins, a graveyard I'd helped dig. My uncle's death would be my final word there. Until then, I let it fester. Ahmed's threats were dust now, locked away while my farm grew stronger. Both battles left marks. The farm's recovery was a marathon, the town's ruin a bitter echo, but I'd claimed them. I'd turned Ahmed's hubris into his shackles, the town's hypocrisy into its epitaph. Standing on my land, I felt the split. One was a wound I'd heal, the other a corpse I'd buried. Neither wiped the slate clean. Ahmed's mess lingered in the soil, the town's scars in my memory, but they proved I could fight back. The farm would bloom again, a testament to grit. The town wouldn't, a monument to justice. I'd outlasted them both, Ahmed's defiance, the town's sanctimony, and that was power, raw and earned, driving me to keep going. The farm's rebirth was in full swing. Fields once scarred by Ahmed's radioactive waste now sprouted tentative green, a quiet defiance against the years of neglect and violation. I'd stand there, hands in the soil, watching the cleanup crew haul off the last barrels, the air finally free of that acrid sting. It had taken months, more money than I'd planned, but the land was mine again, proof I could take back what was stolen, not just from me, but from my family's legacy. My hometown, though, stayed a distant ruin, its pulse fatting in social media snapshots. Boarded windows, vacant lots, the church's steeple looming over a town that lost its soul. My uncle clung to life, a frail relic of the cruelty he'd sown, and I'd only return to dance on his grave. Until then, I let their downfall simmer, a dish best served cold. Ahmed's end was sharper, more final. 10 years behind bars, his kingdom of arrogance reduced to a concrete box, his threats swallowed by prison walls. I'd faced him on my farm, his smirk fueling my rage, and when he doubled down, I'd let the law crush him. Illegal dumping, stolen waste, a criminal web he couldn't outtalk. The courtroom had been my stage, his fall my curtain call. The farm's revival was my redemption, every clean patch of victory over his entitlement, a promise kept to my ancestors. I'd poured in cash, sweat, time, turning poison into possibility, imagining harvests where toxic sludge once seeped. My town's collapse was retribution. My report had slit its throat, no confrontation needed, just a pen and their own incompetence. The factory's death left them gasping, and I watched from afar, savoring the bully's descent, the pious humbled. Ahmed's fight was up close. His "why do you care?" a spark I'd fanned into his undoing. The town was remote, a calculated strike, their misery a slow burn I'd ignited. The farm gave me purpose, the town closure. Standing on my land, I'd see crops coming, a future I'd forged, Ahmed's shadow gone, the soil healing. The town offered no such grace, its wreckage a monument to their sins, my hand on the chisel. My uncle's end would seal it, Ahmed was already dust. Both left echoes, the farm's scars would fade but linger, the town's ruin a bitter taste I'd never shake, but I'd won. I'd turned Ahmed's pride into his chains, the town's sanctimony into its shroud. The farm stood as proof I could rebuild, the town proof I could destroy. Neither erased the past, Ahmed's mess had cost me years, the town's cruelty had shaped me, but they rewrote the story. I'd outlasted them, Ahmed's threats, the town's hypocrisy, turning their weapons into my strength. The farm would thrive, a living testament to resilience. The town wouldn't, a dead warning to entitlement. Justice wasn't clean, my land bore wounds, my soul carried ghosts, but it was mine. I'd fought for the farm, bled for it, and won. I'd buried the town, walked away, and smiled. 2 battles, 2 victories, one I'd plant, one I'd burn. As I watched the sun set over my fields, I knew Ahmed was gone, the town was dust, and I was still here, unbroken, rooted in soil I'd saved, free of a past I'd avenged. That was enough, more than enough, to keep building, one season at a time.